Good afternoon. This is the September 26th, 2023 meeting of the City Finance Committee. Can I have a roll call, please?
Yes, Committee Member Alejandro Gutierrez is not present. Committee Member Harmon?
Here.
Committee Chair Friedman?
Here. Before we get to the item, we will look at public comment. Are there any members of the public that wish to speak to this item that is under the purview of the Finance Committee? Not seeing any in chambers. Is there any online public comment?
Chair Friedman, no hands are raised at this time.
All right, I will close general public comment and turn it over to Mr. DeMartini for the fiscal year 23 fourth quarter review.
Good afternoon, members of the Finance Committee. My name is Keith DeMartini, the city's Finance Director. I'm here with our new controller, Ms. Natalie Licoli, and it is our pleasure to present an overview of the city's fourth quarter financial review for the fiscal year ending in June 30th of 2023. The objective of today's presentation is to receive a report from staff on the status of revenues and expenditures in relation to the budget for the 12 months ending June 30th, 2023, accept the fiscal year 2023 interim financial statements for those 12 months, and then finally recommend that the full City Council approve of the proposed fourth quarter adjustments to the fiscal year 2023 revenue and expenditure appropriations that are detailed in the schedule of proposed adjustments that's in your packet before you today. The agenda for today's presentation is to first receive an update on the general fund. We'll then go into a little bit of detail on the enterprise funds, talk about the proposed budget adjustments that are before you today, and then of course take any questions, public comment, and discussion. This slide shows an overview of our annual review process of the city's financials throughout the year. Every month, there are monthly financial statements that are on consent on the City Council agenda packets. Every quarter, we do a detailed review, collaborating with departments to provide updates on a quarterly basis of what's been spent to date, how much money we've collected to date, but then also making a projections of where we think, based on that information, where we'll end up at the end of that fiscal year. We are at the conclusion of the quarterly financial statement process. We are now feverishly working on preparing our annual comprehensive financial report, scheduled to come before the Finance Committee and later in December. So what that means, though, today is that what information staff will be presenting today is preliminary. These are preliminary year-end numbers for fiscal year 2023. The final numbers will be issued on the ACFR in December. This slide shows the pie chart of all of the general fund revenues that we collect from our various taxes and other departmental revenue sources. And then the pie chart on the right shows where we spend those resources for public safety, community services, public works, and the like. So now let's talk about the general fund on where the numbers are ending up. This slide summarizes the total revenues and total expenditures in the general fund in fiscal year 2023. First, starting with the adopted budget on the left-hand column, showing that the adopted budget did call for about $1 million use of reserves in order to balance the budget. The revised budget shows the changes that occurred to the adopted budget throughout the year. So this will include any action that the City Council takes during a regular City Council meeting to appropriate funds in the general fund for specific projects, and that did occur throughout the year. And then that number also includes commitments and prior year encumbrances of money that will be spent in fiscal year 2023. That's an annual process that we go through. I'll provide a little bit more detail about that as we move along. Where we ended up through Q4 is that our revenues did come in higher, about $10 million in total compared to the budget, but our expenditures also came in higher, primarily due to that carrying forward of prior year appropriation, and then also actions that council took during the year to appropriate money for specific projects that were not originally part of the adopted budget. So when you put all this information together, staff is projecting approximately a $1.3 million deficit by the end of fiscal year 2023, which is actually pretty close to what was prescribed in the adopted budget. On this slide here lists some of the major items that are included in these numbers. One of the largest items that council approved during the year that was not part of the adopted budget was the $1.2 million for the short-term rental enforcement program, and then a number of other programs noted here. You'll see additional revenue that was generated as well. Attrition savings did occur throughout the year, but the amount of attrition savings from vacant positions was less than we've experienced in prior years. There's been a great deal of progress on filling positions that have been vacant. So I want to spend a little bit of time explaining what that concept is from carry forward appropriation. So again, this is an annual process that occurs in conjunction with the annual budget process. And what this process does is it takes commitments and obligations that we have entered into, primarily from contracts that we have, for work, for services, for professional services, for construction, capital projects. And it takes what hasn't been spent on those prior year commitments and carries forward that expenditure appropriation into the next fiscal year. That's in recognition that we have an annual operating budget, but we have commitments from a prior fiscal year that we need to carry forward. Again, this is an annual process that finance coordinates and is approved by the city administrator. That authorization does come from the city council. And it just really makes sure that we have the money available to pay for those prior year commitments. This is typically done for one-time projects and initiatives, and really primarily for capital projects, because we have to have all of that funding in place when we let out a construction contract, but that project may take 2 or 3 years to implement. So it's a standard annual process. I just want to make sure that there was clarity and transparency with that. So moving forward, this slide summarizes some of the major trends that we noted for our largest general fund taxes. First, property tax did come in greater year over year and a little bit greater than budget as well. There are fewer property transactions. However, the sales prices remain strong and continue to grow. So that was a positive sign there. Sales tax did grow as well. It actually did come in greater than our budget amount, but it did not grow year over year. It effectively remained flat in fiscal year 2023 compared to fiscal year 2022. That's in recognition of the activity in fiscal year 2022 being substantially greater than the prior year, the effects of COVID. Also, inflation were a substantial driver of that as well. We have continued to review the need for a recession scenario. We're not projecting any recession for our revenues at this time, but the leveling off indicates that we're plateauing, reaching sort of a new level of normal of our sales tax, and that will likely continue into fiscal year 2024. Similar trend in transient occupancy tax. The transient occupancy tax actually came down a little bit in fiscal year 2023 compared to fiscal year 2022. That again is from 2022 showing record levels of average daily rates for our hotels, and we reached our highest TOT revenue on record. This slide here summarizes the major trends in our general fund taxes. Again, I talked about property, sales tax, and TOT already, and you can see what change we had compared to budget on this slide, and then also you can see the change from year over year. I mentioned sales tax came in just slightly higher. TOT actually came in a little bit lower year over year. You will also notice that although cannabis excise tax is a very small revenue source for us, it came in pretty drastically under budget compared to what we were budgeting, but also lower than the prior fiscal year as well. And then property transfer tax. And this is a tax that the city receives on the transfer of a property only, which is different than your annual property tax assessment. And because there were so far fewer properties that turned over, that sort of changed hands in fiscal year 2023, the amount of tax we collect is significantly lower as well. Again, those aren't large revenue sources for the city's general fund, but it's useful information when understanding what's going on in the industry. Might help us for our budgeting going forward as well. Next, just before I turn it over to Ms. Licoli to talk about our expenditure reduction targets, our expenditures, The fiscal year 2023 adopted budget did call for approximately $1 million of general fund expenditure reductions to help balance the budget. Again, this was a deficit as the city was recovering from the lost revenue from COVID, and then just increased costs throughout the city, primarily related to inflation. These were primarily salary-saving measures that was an effective tool to help us balance the budget. So now I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Licoli, who's going to walk us through our general fund expenditures.
Good afternoon, Chair Friedman and member of the Finance Committee. General fund expenditure. Total pre-audit expenditure, including encumbrance, is 96% of budget for fiscal year 23. As part of our program Vision 2030, departments successfully reduced the expenses. Vacancy for the fiscal year contributed as well to this decrease. As of May 2023, we were 91% staff. Current month, we have a 10.5% vacancy rate. The main variants to highlight on these slides are Public Safety Police Department was 94% of its budget with encumbrance. Let's remark 1.15 million encumbrance related to purchases made during the fiscal year of 23, for which services and revenue will take place in fiscal year 24. A 14% of a budget for non-departmental is attributed to SIF, or Self-Insurance Fund. In 2022, the City Council supported staff recommendation to increase funding to achieve adequate coverage for city facility and operation against future natural disaster. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we'll move into, now that we've talked about the impact on the general fund on revenues and expenditures, we'll talk about what impact the deficit in fiscal year 2023 has on our general fund reserves. So this table here summarizes the general fund reserves over the past 4 fiscal years of actual reserve levels and where staff is projecting our reserves to end up at the end of the fiscal year. This table first starts with what the actual contingency reserves have been in the fund and what the disaster reserves have been for a total reserve level in fiscal year 2023 ending for our target to be $42 million. But because the general fund is ending in a deficit, that does require the use of general fund reserves to help balance. So we are projecting to be approximately $3.8 million below the policy reserve target level at around $38.3 million. It's also important to note, as we've talked about before with the Finance Committee, that the self-insurance fund is currently underfunded. The staff works with an actuary to determine the appropriate level of funding and reserves in the self-insurance fund. And because it is fairly significantly underfunded, the general fund is on the hook for approximately 50% of that underfunded reserve position. And so this line at the bottom here represents the amount that the general fund is potentially on the hook for, approximately $5.8 million, which means that the true remaining level of contingency reserves in the general fund comes down even lower to about $7 million when it really should have about $16 million in the fund. So it's one way of looking at reserves. We typically show this graph here, which the council and committee has seen before, which shows the trend of our general fund reserves over time. It shows our actual disaster reserve levels and our actual contingency reserve levels. And the gray line at the top shows what the targets are in the city council adopted reserve policy. You can see in fiscal year 22, we did achieve meeting our general fund target reserve levels, but because again, the deficit position in fiscal year 2023, it will require using some reserves in order to balance the budget, which means that we are now below target. I'll now turn it back over to Ms. Licoli, who's going to give us an overview of the enterprise funds.
Unlike the general fund that rely primarily on taxes to fund program and services, enterprise funds are financed primarily from user fees and other non-tax revenue. Please note all departments came at fiscal year end with a positive reserve or a reduction in reserve used in comparison to budget. Let's walk briefly through the various departments. Solid Waste Fund came with a net surplus of 1.3 million. This variance is driven by lower expenditure. Two factors came into play. One, budget forecasted a higher cost for contract renewal with Marlboro. And two, vacancies saving on professional services were lower than budget. Water Fund results are decrease in revenue and expenditure. Above average rainfall drove water consumption down and consequently reduced our revenue. Employee turnover and temporary shutdown of the desalinations plant for maintenance contributed to the reduction of actual expenses. $2 million related to supply and services are in transit. When comparing the revenue with fiscal year 22, the main variance is due to grant for a total of $10.5 million that was received during that year. It is now related to direct operational revenue. Waste Fund net result is 88% of budget, with a slight decrease in revenue, which relate to the portion of wastewater rate within water billing revenue. Encumbrance of $1 million relate to CCTV contract prepayment offered at a discount rate. This contract will cover the next 3 years. Downtown Parking Fund is within budget with a reduction in expenses, mainly related to vacancy. Next, please. The Clean Energy Fund. The Clean Energy Fund is the city's newest enterprise providing carbon-free electricity to 96% of the community. All customers were enrolled in March 2022. The energy rate that Santa Barbara Clean Energy Program charged customers is tied to Southern California Edison rates. During fiscal year 23, 2 increases took place with Southern California Edison, which consequently drove a higher rate for Santa Barbara residents. It resulted in addition of $4 million to our reserve. It is important to mention Southern California Edison rate can fluctuate based on the on-cost driver. Consequently, expenses should be analyzed in relationship to revenue generated, not comparing expense to expense from one year to another. The next 3 funds listed on this slide are customer driver. Weather play a major role on the outcome of revenue sources. Fiscal year 2023 was budgeted conservatively because of uncertainty with the impact of the pandemic. The Airport Fund. The Airport Fund continued to see a strong level of commercial airline passenger activity. Actual surplus in revenue is a combination of this last one, as well as parking, ground transportation, and rental car. We notice a decrease of 9.6% with fiscal year 22. It is due to a federal grant, ARPA, for $6.3 million that was received in 22 for operational and concession. Expenditure is under budget, mainly due to vacancy. Golf Fund revenue performance is still strong, specifically during this last quarter when golfers returned in full force after the rainy period. The concession unit, a restaurant, had a successful fiscal year with an excess of $232,000 in revenue. Waterfront Fund account for the operation of public wharf, a small craft harbor, and parking facilities. Commercial lease and food services, which are the main driver for this revenue line, exceeded budget by 10.5%, and fiscal year 22 by 5.6%. Lease revenue increased annually with CPI, and 10% commission is collected in excess of gross sale after a certain threshold. A combination of positions being held vacant and carefully controlled costs dropped the expenses to about 6.8% below budget. C'est vrai? Then I'm going to turn it to the next slide, enterprise fund and projected reserve. As discussed in the prior slide, all enterprise funds performed better than fiscal year 23 projection. Solid waste, water, golf, and waterfront follow a consistent trend by increasing their reserve annually. Wastewater used $68,676 of its reserve, mainly due to the relationship with decrease in water consumption revenue due to a significant number of rainfall during the last few months. Downtown parking showed a deficit at year-end, which is partially offset by fiscal year 22 positive reserve. Clean energy made a significant turnaround, showing a positive result at the end of fiscal year. This result absorbed almost two-thirds of our $9.6 million negative reserve that incurred during the fiscal year 22. Airport. The reduction in reserve for fiscal year 23 was fully absorbed by prior year positive reserve, resulting to a positive $3.1 million balance at the end of fiscal year 23. This operation that was significantly impacted by the pandemic should see some strong outcome. Okay, so then we're going to move into the proposed budget amendment, if you would like. The first one is related to, for general fund, to the police department. Utilize the police department's salary saving to cover negative reserve balance in the residential street swiping fund. As a reminder, residential street swiping fund was under budget mainly due to cancellation of services because of weather condition. Library department. Utilize the salary saving to cover increased costs related to digital collection. The saving for $200,000 would precisely cover the purchase of e-book and audiobook. Most publishers only allow for one copy, one user licensing model, so additional purchases are needed. Public Work would want to transfer the surplus of revenue to cover an enhancement of the Acela parking software. So those are the main ones related to the general fund I would like to highlight. And on the last slide, those are other different budget adjustments that I would like to propose. I will pause for a few minutes to give you time to acknowledge the information. And then I will turn it to Keith. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Licoli. Appreciate that. Just a few more slides here to wrap up. On this slide shows the recent history and the projection going forward of the reserve position in the city's self-insurance fund. We spoke about this a little bit earlier in the presentation. Again, we have a plan that's in place that the Finance Committee approved a little over a year ago that staff has been building into our annual budget proposals before the full City Council to ramp up the reserves over a 9-year period. But as you can see in this graph, the actual cash that we have in the fund and what's being projected in the next 7 to 8 years is still far below what the actuarial is recommending the level to be. So we have work to do. This will be a continual conversation with this committee and for council for future budget considerations. Staff's recommendation before the committee today is to accept to recommend that the council accept the fiscal year 2023 interim financial statements ending June 30th, 2023, and recommend that the full city council approve of the fourth quarter proposed budget adjustments for fiscal year 2023. That concludes our presentation. We'd be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation, and welcome to the city, and thank you for the presentation. And open up to questions from my colleagues.
I have a question. Mr. DeMartini, can you explain how the police department's salary savings is going to cover the negative reserve balance for the street sweeping fund? Just, if you can explain to the public why the street sweeping fund? Why is that money going specifically there? It just sounds weird. We're saving on public safety salaries, and then we're going to put it in the street. Like, if you could just give us more context on that, please.
Yes, Committee Member Gutierrez. So as far as the city has a separate fund for residential street sweeping. It generates its own revenue, and then all expenses related to street sweeping are incurred in that fund. I don't have information right now to explain why that fund had a negative reserve position in it. So the city administrator might have some information to share. But what I will say is that using salary savings in the police department as a solution is important to note here, primarily because there are many vacant positions in the police department. So we budget for positions to be filled. When there are vacancies that occur during the year, that results in salary savings, which is reduced expenditure. And so this is a budget adjustment to just take some of that money that wasn't spent on a position that is vacant and use that to help that fund that had a negative reserve position.
Chair Friedman, committee members, Rebecca Bjork, City Administrator. So the reason that you're seeing the funding for residential street sweeping in the police department is because the police department does the enforcement, and a large amount of the revenues is generated from the enforcement. We were down substantially on parking enforcement officers over the last year, and then the weather also affected the program where we don't sweep, we don't pay. This is a general fund use. The remainder of the fund expenses are covered by Measure B. So if you wanted to do something differently, you could instead take it out of Measure B reserves. But this proposal directly links the lack of revenue to the source of the lack of revenue, which was salaries, which is why that proposal was made.
Thank you.
All right, I just have a couple of questions. If you could pull up slide 10. So I just wanted to go over the revenue. So it looks like with the TOT and the sales tax, they're coming in relatively close. One's higher, one's lower than the prior year. Do we have any indication going into this fiscal year of any numbers from the first quarter or so?
Chair Friedman, at this time, we don't have any current data for the first couple of months in fiscal year 2024 for sales tax. We will get our first quarterly sales tax report within the next month and a half, I believe. And so when we bring the quarter one report to the Finance Committee in November, staff will have updated information for that at this time. Just yesterday, staff issued a media release for the monthly tax remittances for transient occupancy tax. Staff issues a media release every month because we do get that information monthly. And what it does show is that the TOT revenue being collected for the first 2 months in fiscal year 2024 are coming in a little bit lower compared to the monthly budget target that we have in fiscal year 2024. So it is a little bit low compared to budget.
So, okay, so, and that's getting into the next year. I just wanted to see if we're having any indications or if the trends are starting, or kind of similar that we're seeing the first couple months as we were seeing last year where it's flattened out. And then overall, this was a $1.3 million deficit is approximately what we're looking at for the past fiscal year, and along with the reserves. So I don't have any other further questions. So I'll now open it up to public comment. Are there any members of the public that wish to speak to this item? There's nobody in chambers. Is there anybody online? Please raise your hand in the app.
Chair Friedman, no hands are raised.
All right, I will close public comment and now turn over to my colleagues for comments and recommendation.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. I'll be brief. Thank you again for another really informative presentation. Really appreciate it. And I'm happy to move that we approve the proposed fourth quarter adjustments and expenditure appropriations as detailed by staff.
Motion's been made. Is there a second?
Second?
Great. And so I just also want to thank staff for the presentation. We do have, looks like we have a little bit of headwinds going forward. Revenues are leveling off. There was the anomaly year of everybody coming out where there was exponential growth, but it seems like we're getting back into a more normal growth. So we'll just continue to monitor this and some of our reserves, the self-insurance fund and our contingency reserves over time. But with that, I have no further comments, so we just need to vote on that. And so it was moving the staff recommendation. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Abstentions? Hearing none. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.